Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachael Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. Well, thanks for listening and being with us today. I'm here with Dan, and we wanted to take a moment and kind of disrupt our normal podcast series plan to just take a moment to touch base and check in the midst of all that is unfolding with COVID-19 and this unique strand of the coronavirus that is sweeping the globe. And as we know in our own world, both in Seattle and where I live in Philly and our work with the Allender Center, but as we're all watching, it has some major implications and hugely terrifying and disruptive implications for our lives. And so we wanted to just take a moment and be with you in the midst of this.
And our desire is not to somehow resolve all the things that are at work in each of our lives. I currently am in the garage because my wife asked me to leave our home. I can say maritally, we're doing fine. But the bottom line is I have a sinus infection, and several days from now, my son is donating a kidney to one of our dear friends, and to keep our house well, because his children will be there for the next 5 or 6 days. I have been exiled. It's not a big deal. But on the other hand, it is a deal because it's a very uncomfortable thing to be asked to leave your home, take a few pieces of clothing, set up camping gear in your garage, and do what's right in the midst of a chaotic period. So I think we can establish two things quickly. We take this serious. We do not think this is a hoax. We don't think this is a mere exacerbation of the flu. That we are in a serious season in which I think we can say without much doubt, things will not be the same forever, and certainly not for a long season. And therefore, we're right in the middle of trauma. And that is our work, to engage the human heart and to address the effects of trauma, whether it be sexual violation, whether it be the loss of a job, whether it be divorce. But in this case, a global pandemic cannot help but bring the issues of trauma to the surface.
Indeed. And so we're not trying to solve. We have no illusions that we can solve this issue or that we can provide an in-house immediate solution. But we do think we can offer just some presence and some words and some language for some of the experience of this moment, and hopefully offer some encouragement and some practical resources of how to tend and how to love well in the midst of this moment.
So let us remind you that one of the first things that happens when a person, or in this case, a family or a culture, begins to experience significant trauma is the normal response of fight, flight, or freeze. And Rachael, you know that your history is a little different than mine. So how have you begun to address the COVID-19 reality? And I can put words to my approach.
Sure. Well, I'm a storm-born woman. So I'm the person who is reading all the news, not just coming out of the United States, but coming out of any news source I can find, both, the more global perspectives of the well-known news stations, but also the on-the-ground journalists and people who are just sharing their experiences from all around the world. And so I have been anticipating kind of the moment we find ourselves in currently, where schools are closing, where local governments and national governments are declaring states of emergency, where we're all just trying to make sense of
how do we both stay safe, but also how do we live when there's going to be an extended period of disruption? So I've kind of been in a heightened state of anxiety and watchfulness and preparation. And I am a fighter. So I both anticipate and attune and storm watch and look for all the warning signs and the threats, but also prepare for how to not just keep myself safe in the midst of it, for how to keep the people I love safe, but also how to love others well and to protect the vulnerable. So I have kind of been preparing and watching all the things.
And I know for sure you're a fighter, but given a long history of anxiety and fear, you would think that your response would have been more one of flight. How so do you see the interplay of fight and flight with regard to your experience, and one that I think would be very comparable to many of the people that will be listening to this podcast?
As far as like, why didn't I flee?
Yes.
Because I think the nature of like the way I deal with fear is kind of this sense of, well, if I know what I'm up against, then maybe I have some volition to do something. And so I have never had the luxury of fleeing or, checking out or going into denial. In fact, all of my anxiety dreams, I'm usually warning people of some imminent danger, and everyone's looking at me like, dude,
you're crazy.
Yeah.
Yep. No, and generally people know that I'm a fighter, but with regard to things like this, I just ignore it. And I mean, one of the first times we were listening to our news structure, I think it was NBC News, and they said, the major concern is for the elderly. And I said, well, to Becky in the middle of the broadcast, I said, oh, good, we're at least not in that category. And she looked at me with a look like, are you crazy? And I said, what? She said, how old do you think elderly is now considered regarding this disease? And I said, what, 75? She said, above 60. Oh my goodness. That was one of those moments where I just sort of figure that unless it has a face, there's nothing I can do about it. And therefore, I'm much more committed to fleeing the reality. I don't want to watch the news. I don't want to get more data. But in that sense, we all have this intersection between fight and flight. We may have a predominant, but we always have some intersection, including that third category is just freezing. And sometimes watching the news can be a form of just literally freezing before the amount of data that feels like we have no shape, no control, no power whatsoever.
Okay, well, maybe there's been a little bit of freeze for me.
Well, the task is in many ways not to just come to one awareness or another, but to be aware of how all three are playing out in this process. Because if you're not afraid, then you are living at a level of denial and a level of presumption that actually is dangerous, not just to yourself, but frankly, to your family, to your friends, and anyone with whom you're with. We are not going to repeat the obvious statements of make sure you're washing your hands often. If you touch something, you're going to likely touch your face. So if you're in a place, public or private, that other people are touching, it's wise to care for your hands and yourself by washing. Social distancing. We don't need to go back through the common things that we ought to be doing. We really want to begin to address, can we begin the process of knowing how will we individually, corporately, as a believing community, who do we want to become? How will we engage a life disruption that I think we'll look back on and say that this season changed the direction of the globe, let alone each and every individual life? And so as you think about it, Rachael, what are you doing and what are you inviting me and us to engage with regard to the fear of COVID-19?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is to take it seriously, not the fear, but the reality. And I think it's really hard with something like a pandemic because it may not be impacting your community at this particular time in the way you're seeing it impact other communities. And so it can almost feel like, oh, I don't, we're fine. Let's go on as if life is normal. And I think sometimes our bodies, when we go on as if life is normal, when life is anything but normal, is actually increases anxiety. Our bodies get louder. So I think follow the leadership of your local authorities, of your pastors, of your doctors and medical professionals. So, it is really hard to hear that social distancing is one of the number one things we need to do. Because if anything, this is a time where we want to be with people. We want to be with our community. We want to kind of defiantly go on, go about ourselves in public, go to restaurants, go do what we want. And the bind that we want to support local businesses. We want people to stay in business. We want to help in a time of need. So for me, it has been trying to figure out, okay, I need to face some reality here. What are some of the significant changes that need to come? I'm sitting in my little study in Philadelphia, and we just got word about 2 hours ago that our kids' schools in the whole entire state of Pennsylvania are going to be closed for the next 2 weeks. So there's some very practical realities of trying to figure out how will we take care of childcare? If we're working from home, if they're learning virtually, if they're not learning virtually, what are the kind of day in, day out routines that have kind of been our normal that are now going to need to shift? At this juncture, where I live in Philly, our church has gone virtual. Many of you may or may not know, the Seattle school has banned all travel for its employees for the next month and a half. And that also means that, in many ways, we're trying to figure out how we carry out life with our larger community in a way that is still tending to the moment, offering the good work that we do, but in a way that's more accessible if people can't hop on a plane and fly to be with you. There are just some very real, tangible realities. And I tend to be someone who wants to help people face reality, because if you can actually start to own, okay, this is where we're at, then you actually get to be creative about how you move in the midst of it. I also think it's okay to acknowledge that this has real impact on our mental health. And some of us actually need to do the brave work of reaching out and asking for help. Maybe you have some phobias, maybe you have anxiety, maybe you have depression, maybe you have maybe not mental health, maybe you have true physical health concerns. For many of us who do struggle with chronic illness or have compromised immune systems, this is a very scary time. And so I do think it's important to take a step back from the media, to have a plan, to reach out, to touch base with someone you love. Like I've been trying to practice. Well, I've had to practice this because I live 2,000-3,000 miles away from most of my best friends, and I'm still trying to make friends in Philly. How do you reach out to the people you love in some small ways? Send a text message, just hop on FaceTime, or send a little video on, Dan, what's that app? You've got Marco Polo?
Marco Polo, yes.
I think this is a time to be connected to the people who know you and love you. Really basic things. Like I've done a lot of work in disaster relief and have had the privilege of being with people in the midst of more collective natural disaster traumas. And there's some really good kind of practical steps of making sure your very practical needs are anticipated. Do you have food? Do you check in with your neighbors? See how everyone's doing. Do they need some help with childcare? Are they able to get to the grocery store? I think when we can actually embrace where we're at, we get to start thinking about how we want to love the people in our midst.
Well, even that is such a huge issue. And that is, how much are we going to operate out of fear and how much out of love. I got a email this morning from our pastor saying to our church that we will not be meeting, and yet what we'll be doing is choosing to meet in smaller groups and also virtually. And he made a very important point, and an article that we'll eventually tell you about, Andy Crouch as well said, we can operate out of fear and do some of the very same things that we can operate out of love and do. But the difference will be whether or not we are closing in and shutting down, or whether we're opening our heart for more. In the midst of this, I think what it has done for me is to be able to say, as the World Health Organization has indicated, 70% of people in America will likely have COVID-19. We are beyond the idea of being able to contain, and we're in the realm of cure. But we don't want to inundate our health system. So the goal is not just to avoid getting ill, it's to do the things that we need to do, but out of regard, yes, for ourselves, yes, for our family. But this is our season, particularly as a believing community, where we can come back to ultimately say, are you actually afraid of death? And if so, it's binding you, not just in terms of living, but in terms of being able to offer your heart. We all are afraid of dying. We're all afraid of suffering. We're afraid of the kind of financial implications that aren't just ahead. They're happening right now. So the question of how are you going to care for yourself, for your family, for your neighbors, for your world? And I think this is a season where particularly the believing community has an opportunity to do that which honors who we are. And a passage I've been looking at through this season comes from Psalm 112. And it says, surely he will never be shaken. This is the righteous man and woman. A righteous person will be remembered forever. He will have no fear of bad news. His heart is steadfast, trusting in the Lord. Well, I have to be very honest and say, I'm shaken. I feel already like there's so much bad news that I'm being captured by. So it isn't pressure to believe and not be afraid. It's clarity that in the middle of fear, can we honor and care for our body, care for our soul and our physicality and our relationships in a way in which we don't have to pretend, but we also have to dream. And that is, we have to begin not to wish for things to be as they once were. We have to begin to allow ourselves to say, our world is going to change. It is changing. And that will be true almost for every element, including how we shake hands or not. But actually, we get to begin already to imagine, I would love to become the kind of person that indeed bad news doesn't shake me. My heart is steadfast. You know, when it goes on to say his heart is secure, he will have no fear. In the end, he will look and triumph over his foes. Well, even if I know my life and my heart don't fully reflect that, at least at this moment, I can pray that through this process, I will become the person I'm meant to be, whether I live or die. And knowing that I will die one day, now I can, in one sense, embrace good care with wisdom, but without, in one sense, the compelling, compulsive need to somehow fix where we are.
Well, and I just love that sense of, I mean, I'm going to be straight up honest here, and I feel like I'm pretty honest on this podcast, but I am pretty neurotic when it comes to germs and staying well. I pursue a lot of naturopathic medicine and essential oils and acupuncture, and really believe in holistic health and think good health starts in the gut and the whole thing. And I would love to say I have not been scared, but I have been so neurotic. And I have to watch where I feel my heart wanting to turn towards scarcity, towards self-preservation, at the risk of really turning my back on my neighbor. I can feel that pull to want to just turn inward, to shut the door and basically be like, I'll emerge 2 months from now. Now, don't get me wrong. I am going to actually ask my family. We are going to try to practice social distancing in a way that takes seriously that we may be fine, even if we get this virus. But not everyone that we will be around or come in contact with has that luxury of that kind of privileged safety. And so we want to love in that way. But I do not want my heart to be given over to a lack of imagination or creativity that says, like, how do I stay connected to my faith community in a different way? What is it that I have to learn about a reminder of our interconnectedness and how connected we really are as a global community and in our local communities? And, and like, how patient can I be? Where am I willing to, I don't have a choice, right? Like, I have to be patient. I'm going to be working from home, which I do, while also trying to tend to young boys who have a lot of energy and are going to be so excited to not be in school until it gets really boring.
That's really horrible funny.
Yeah. And so, I think I just want to like own like the very human reality of, I don't know if any of us have the luxury in the midst of this kind of crisis or trauma to just be the best version of ourselves. But I think there's an invitation to be vulnerable, to be honest, and to learn and to grow together. And that's where I would just say I was on the Twitter today, which is one of my confessions as well, that I need to not spend as much time on Twitter. But there have been all these videos surfacing of people in Italy, the Italians, who have been under quarantine now for almost a week. And they're singing. And the street is full of singing that's coming from the apartments and the homes that are surrounding. And you can't really, it's usually at night, and you can't see people because no one's in the street. They're all in their homes, but you can hear everyone joining in. And for me, that's just kind of a picture of what I think Jesus can invite us to in these moments, in these valley moments where trauma really does shut down our capacity to imagine. It shuts down our capacity to find language for what is happening. It shuts down our capacity to stay present. There's a real pull to want to numb, to want to dissociate, to want to isolate. And I think my call to us would be that we would do the good, courageous work of leaning into an invitation to love boldly as people who, I love what you're saying, who have already been baptized with Jesus, who have said, like, I don't have to fear death because it doesn't have the final word. And that's not an indictment against being afraid. And I hope we're nuancing that well.
Well, I think that fact of being able to hold both, I'm afraid, but in that fear, I know it's so counterproductive to try to escape the fear. I woke up at about 3 a.m. thinking about my son, surgery. He's doing such a bold, courageous, loving act. I am so proud of him. But I wanted to call him at 3 a.m. and say, you can't do it right now. You can't do it. But just being able to literally, I literally physically sat up in bed. I put my arms around myself, and I literally just started tapping on both sides of my arms just to be able to calm my body, my heart, and to know that I will call my son, but not to tell him no, simply to tell him again, I am so proud. I think one of the things we have to make a very deep decision about, because we do not know the future other than this is not going to go away. The hardships are going to remain and grow. Can we remain human and bound to love, bound to the love of Jesus, bound to the love of one another in a way in which we're not fragmenting and then choosing to dissociate in order to escape, spending hours on, any media, Netflix, Facebook, whatever, but actually saying we need to care for one another. And a phone call to a good friend is a lot more gracious than weathering this by just getting a lot more information. Can we stay human? And can we keep from scapegoating? This is one of the big concerns I have for us as a nation. Are we going to look for someone to blame in the midst of fear that fragments and trauma that intrudes?
Well, I think our human nature in every biblical story tells us that, yes, we are going to do that. So how can we be aware of our tendency to need an enemy, to need a common enemy, to blame? And I'm not that. For me, I will just speak candidly. I don't think that there's anything wrong with being frustrated with some of the ways this has been handled by many people, many of our leaders, and the way information has been either withheld or not given accurately. There's nothing wrong with having frustration and being able to look back and say, this could have been handled very differently. And hopefully we will learn from this, because I don't think this is the last time we're going to have a global pandemic. I think we are far too connected in our world today, and this will happen again. But how can we be aware of that tendency to want to blame, whether it's wanting to blame that this virus originated in China and wanting to use that as an excuse to be racist, to bring violence and harm and accusation and blame to people. And so I do think that needs to be called out, and it needs to be contended with, both in our hearts and in our communities.
Oh gosh, yes. And when we say a particular people group gets blamed, then we can also say that oftentimes it isn't even a people group. It's just somebody that you want to turn against. It could be your son who's home for 3 days and bugging you, and all of a sudden you unleash a level of just frustration. It is scapegoating because you don't know what to do with this mounting anxiety, fragmentation, uncertainty, powerlessness, etc., that chokes us. And eventually we want to, in some sense of the word, regurgitate and to stop and to be allowed to be able to say, we've got to take walks. When I got to my little garage cave, Becky brought food. She left a lot of things. I just screamed. I just literally screamed for about 30 seconds. And I literally walked to the mirror and looked at my face and just went, well, any better? And I looked in the mirror and I went, not much. I said, well, at least there's been that engagement. We've got to find humor and not dark gallows, well, a little, but mostly the ability to, in one sense, resurrection laugh, to know that death has no sting. And I, like many, I love the scripture. I'm in the scripture, but I've been in the scriptures a lot more over the last several weeks than I have regularly been. And that's good news. So for us to begin that process of going, look, there are a few things you can do. Wash your hands, social distance, but more important than that, though that's incredibly important, is to be asking, how do I want to be? How do I want to become in the midst of this growing global tragedy and trauma? And second, how am I going to engage the people close, near, and far in order to be part of? I love that image of the Italian singing that I live in the suburbs. I couldn't hear my neighbors if they were screaming at one another. But how do we sing, in one sense, speak and sing together in a way in which our hearts really, even in distancing, actually are closer together than what we were before? That's how we're going to approach, at least from the standpoint of the Allender Center. We'll be back addressing more of this, but at least for now, We're praying for you. We ask that you pray for us. And we're in this together. We are in this process together. And we look forward to who we become as the Allender Center as a result of our care of you and your care of us.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add that if you really do want to read a good article by Andy Crouch, a brilliant and beautiful Christian thinker, pastor, leader, you can find his article, Love in the Time of Coronavirus, on the Praxis Journal. You can just Google that. And a lot of what we're talking about today has been informed by that, and we don't need to reinvent that wheel. But know that our hearts are with you, and this is a time to move tenderly and to take courage. So let us all fix our eyes on Jesus.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.